Yeah, so I think we have a critical mass. We should get started. Um, Hello, everyone. I am so happy that you were able to virtually join us today for this book reading. My name is Natalia Otero. I am the co-founder and executive director of DC Safe. If you are new to us, please check us out on our website. I am honored to be here today to introduce Rachel Louise Snyder, who is honestly a force of nature. I'm not exactly sure how we got connected with her, but I do remember and will always remember our first lunch together. We sat down and she told me about her project, and I was just so impressed with her depth of knowledge about domestic violence and the field, and was just really excited about this book. We at DC Safe have a library, and I've read a lot of industry books, and I always say that this one is accessible in a way that is innovative and new, and I'm so proud to have been a part of it. And it was no small feat. It took many, many years to get it right, and Rachel really wanted to get it right, and I thank her for that. The following months after meeting her for the first time, she became our shadow. She followed our advocates. She asked tons of questions. She hopped in a police car and sat and watched our advocates do their thing. And I think her thoughtfulness is really, it really shows in the end product. So I'm very happy to have her. I also give her a bunch of kudos for keeping domestic violence at the forefront of our minds with all of her collaborations with news outlets like the New York Times, the LA Times. If you have not read her article, do so. It's amazing. So yes, I hope that we are all able to learn and enjoy having this conversation together. I would like to introduce our moderator for this evening, Dana Emanuel. She is a supporter of DC Safe, and we were just talking when we first met, and she mentioned that she had read the book, and that is how this event kind of happened, that she had a book club that was local and that they had just reviewed it. And so I am happy to give the floor to her. Thank you so much for being here and for moderating for us.
Great. Thanks, Natalia. I'm so grateful to be here with all of you tonight in support of DC Safe and to learn from Rachel. And so just to give you a sense of the structure for our evening, Rachel and I will talk for about 30 minutes or so. We'll see where the conversation takes us, and then we'll leave plenty of time to respond to your questions. So please enter those questions into the chat box at any time throughout the conversation. And when we get to that Q&A portion, I will do my best to elevate and moderate those questions as they come in and give Rachel the opportunity to respond. So Rachel, you know, Natalia mentioned that my book club read No Visible Bruises. That's how I got to know about DC Safe. But it really resonated with me. No Visible Bruises really resonated deeply with me and my book club, and of course, readers nationwide. And so, you know, I was already aware of the general kind of issue with domestic violence, the broad problem that it is in our country and around the world. But reading your book really highlighted what I didn't know. And there were some moments that I just gasped and had to stop and really, really, really consider what you were saying in the book. So I'm really think that part of this is due to how you structured the book and how you divided it into sections, how you told stories. And so my first question to you is really, if you can talk about why and how you decided to structure the book and divide it in the way that you did.
Thank you, Dana. And also, thank you, Natalia. I just want to say, as a working journalist and a working writer, these days, it's not an easy job. And it's harder every year, it feels like. And what you have to ask someone to do when you are working on a book like this is to really trust you without knowing you. And as Natalia said, like I really shadowed them. I went to the courthouse late at night, super creepy to be in a courthouse of a major American city late at night. hanging out with the police, hanging out with her response line, and like everything I asked for, the organization DC Safe said yes. I mean, they didn't say no ever, and that is rare. And if you want to really tell the story, you have to be given access. And so I thank you for the things that you said, but I also want to acknowledge that like there was real trust between both of us, and I can't do my job without people who are willing to kind of let me in and be vulnerable. So I just want to acknowledge that, you know, kind of publicly. To answer your question, you know, I'm trained as a fiction writer. I mean, I've never taken a class in journalism in my life. It's hard to believe because I've been a working journalist for 25 years now. But I still think as a fiction writer, I still think in terms of story. Like my daughter and I'm in Pittsburgh right now, I'm in a hotel room. And my daughter and I were walking around a cemetery earlier today. We had been visiting my dad's grave, and I was looking at we were looking at the names, you know, like Edith, Mary May, like, you know, Betty, like all these kind of old fashioned names. And even in my mind, I'm thinking of stories for them. And, you know, looking at the years they died, like some of them had been born during the Civil War and stuff. So I feel like when I came to domestic violence, those aha moments that you talked about, Dana, those like moments where it's like, oh, when a victim doesn't show up to renew a restraining order, many times it means that the situation is worse, not better, right? That's just one. I had so many of those aha moments. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, those are like the data points that I have to get across. But I'm writing this to a population that couldn't care less about domestic violence. I mean, I didn't want just advocates to read this book, right? I wanted the rest of like the reading population in this country to read it. So it really was like, how do I structure this like a novel? How do I structure this so that from sentence to sentence, you can't put the book down, even though it's a book about domestic violence, you know? And so that's really how I thought about it. I mean, had a very calculated view in the first section of the book, which is called The End, because it is about domestic violence homicide. It is the literal end of a life. I introduce a character named Michelle, and we know on page 1 that Michelle is not going to make it. Like, as you know, as readers, I'm not giving it, and there's no spoiler alert there. So my role became, what happens if you know the end of a story? Like, what is going to keep you reading? You have to find out where the heartbeat is, you know? And when you're writing a regular narrative, those heartbeats are plot points, right? And it's like, you know, this thing happens and then this thing. In a story, in someone's real life story, you can't manipulate it. You're relegated to what actually happened. So once I realized that it's not her death that is going to haunt people, where systems could have intervened to stop her death. That became sort of the narrative and the haunting thing for me, and the thing that I think makes people read from one page to the next. And it is really, by the time you get to the end of her story, you see so easily how she could have stayed alive, so easily.
Yeah, I think that really helps me understand better how you weaved in and blended so effectively the storytelling and the statistics. We hear stories, we're inundated with statistics, I should say, on the challenges we face in our society. And so sometimes we can become numb to those statistics. And so part of what you did so beautifully is tell stories. You know, for me, that's how I really came to be kind of motivated to reach out to DC Safe, see how I could get involved, is because of those stories and the way that you told them. And it felt more urgent than in other ways that I'd heard about domestic violence in the past. And I'm curious if you can talk about how storytelling with survivors and victims of domestic violence and abusers is different from how you might report on other types of human stories.
Yeah, it's really, really frustrating. I did not fully appreciate it because I have a background in reporting, you know, stories around the world, stories of human rights, you know, women gang raped for sport in Cambodia, Tibetan women forcibly sterilized in China, lots and lots of child marriage. There's all these sort of deep, dark stories that I've done, but the difference in those compared to domestic violence is that domestic violence is an ongoing story. And so it creates not just a potentially dangerous situation for the people involved, but also a deeply ethically complicated story for me. What can I tell? How can I tell the story without having people in danger? And there are people that there's a woman in Massachusetts that I spent over a year interviewing, and she eventually ended up having to be cut out entirely because her situation was so dangerous. And she lived in like a witness protection program. Her mail was delivered by private courier. She had a lifetime restraining order against her ex. And so I think we don't fully appreciate that when we're reading a story. As a result of that, stories get covered kind of inadequately. I mean, every time I see a headline that's like domestic disturbance ends in homicide, I'm like, it's not a domestic disturbance. Like, it's a crime. It's a crime. Like, let's call it a crime, right? It's not a private matter. It's not a guy that just snapped, right? There's always a long history of abuse in these situations. Just because we might not see it as neighbors doesn't mean it's not there. So I think that we don't do a great job reporting it because it's so ethically complicated. And the way to get around that kind of thing, I've discovered, is just time, right? It just takes a lot of time to report on these things. And time is like the one thing we're in short supply of always in the modern age,
Mm-hmm. I want to highlight kind of what you said, like that the headlines can maybe, I don't know, give a different sense of what's actually happening, or the language used is not quite as urgent or as evocative. And so some of the comments in your book, I was like, oh, gasp. It was different types of language that I hadn't heard, around domestic violence. Intimate partner terrorism is one.
Mm-hmm.
We're reading in your book and going, that tells in and of those three words tells a totally different story to me of what is happening.
It does.
So,
I read a headline that was something like, it was last year, I think, and it was something like, man kills wife, children unharmed. And I was like, I know what you mean by that. I know you mean he didn't kill the children also, but like, those children are not unharmed, right? Those children are now groomed to be either the victims or the perpetrators if we don't intervene in some way. I mean, it just drove me crazy. Language matters so much. Think about a word like anti-racist or anti-racism, which was coined by, my as of a couple of weeks ago, former colleague, but he was my colleague, Ibram Kendi. And one of the brilliant things he did in his book, which everybody should read if you haven't read it, Stamped from the Beginning, is create a term to recast our thinking. Mm-hmm. So, and it's part of what I think makes his work particularly effective. And it's something that I really struggled with, because I have always wanted to come up with a better term than domestic violence. I mean, we started with battered woman syndrome, mm-hmm. which is not much better, right? It's pathologizing for starters. Right. It also doesn't get at the psychology of, there's a lot of problems with it. Domestic violence is like sort of an improvement because at least it's more inclusive, but it doesn't get at what the real terror is of living inside a situation where there is this kind of intimate terrorism. And I don't even say intimate partner terrorism anymore, because I feel like that's exclusionary, right? You can have mothers who are, terrorizing their children, or, a brother who is abusive to his sister or whatever. To get back to the story, just to illustrate the story of Michelle, no one really ever saw her with injuries. She didn't talk about physical violence, even at the end, all that much. She talked about it in one single affidavit. But instead, her husband, Rocky, would do things like he would take the kids and he would just disappear with them, and she wouldn't know where they were. She'd be scared to death, right? Mm-hmm. And in that way, he kept control over her. At one point, he went and got a rattlesnake from outside of town, and he kept that rattlesnake in a cage and told her, I'm going to put this in bed with you if you do anything to piss me off, or I'm going to put this in the shower with you. This is not, there's a reason my book is called No Visible Bruises, right? And think about living with 2 small children and a rattlesnake in your house. Like, just take a breath and think about the terror of that. That's why intimate terrorism is the perfect term for it. It's imperfect, of course, because we have so many other associations with the word terrorism. So I'm still grappling with that a little bit, but I do think that the way that we have always worded it has made it appear less urgent than it is, you know, to police, to the population at large, to lawmakers, to all of us.
Well, this is another aspect of the book I found valuable, is like it really helped me dispel some of the myths that I had or that society has created around domestic violence. And, you know, this idea that is very early in your book around, you know, the way in which women, or those who are being abused, primarily women, are trying to get out of an abusive situation. We always are asking why they stay, but really we're watching a process of slow and methodical planning, a process of trying to leave. It's very well thought out in many cases. And so I really appreciated the book for encouraging me to challenge some of the ways that I had kind of understood or thought I understood domestic violence, with language, with these myths. So I want to thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. That was really a learning moment to me too. And you'll see if the paperback of the book came out a couple of weeks ago, and I talk a little bit about being the person who knew none of this before I wrote this book, right? Mm-hmm. So every time you have one of these like, oh, right, moments, like, just rest assured that I had it first. Like, that was my moment first. And one of the biggest ones is around this question of, why doesn't she just leave, right? I mean, I put the emphasis on she because I mean he and trans folks and, you know, LGBTQ, so I'm trying to be inclusive. But, that question is problematic, not merely because it puts the impetus for action on the victim in a crime situation, but because they do leave. They leave all the time. But leaving is not, a suitcase packed at the door, heading out for the weekend. Mm-hmm. Leaving is this methodical. In the case of Michelle, again, I talk about the things that she was doing to try to leave, to try to create a life in which she would be able to raise her children. She was in school trying to get a nursing degree. They lived in her father's house. They rented it from her father. She had secretly arranged with her father to buy the house in a land contract and had put the house in her name, so that when she eventually called the police on Rocky, his name wasn't anywhere on the deed, so that she would be able to get him out. This is meticulous. Mm-hmm. And these things take months or sometimes years to work out. And she would say to her sister would say, you got to go to Colorado, just go to Arizona. And she would say, where am I going to go in this world that he won't find me? You can't just start your kids with a new identity in school, right? Papers follow us wherever we go. It's part of the modern age. So there is this real level of practicality to this question that people don't think about. There's a reason that women, men too, but mostly women, get killed when they're leaving. There's a reason that is the most dangerous time for victims to be killed, is when they're really attempting to leave. It's such a deep misunderstanding about domestic violence.
And I'll say too, just a highlight to me of how important the work of DC Safe is in that crucial period of time as well. I also want to ask you about kind of the urgency of the pandemic and what that has meant for the state of domestic violence, intimate terrorism. You finished researching and writing No Visible Bruises before anybody had heard of COVID-19. I haven't read the paperback version. My book club read the hardcover version last summer. So you might, also have addressed this in the paperback, but in what ways has the pandemic affected domestic violence in the US?
Yeah, I wrote the paperback afterward before the pandemic too, so
Okay.
you're in the clear. I knew immediately in March that things were going to be bad. Being locked in a home with your abuser, that's a scary, scary thought to a lot of people around the country. The thing is, we really don't know how bad it is yet. We know that it's bad. We know that hotline calls have gone up and down. For example, the National Domestic Violence Hotline in the beginning had like their calls kind of dropped off, which was a bad sign, right? It means that it means that victims are not able to find a quiet moment to make that call. Then they went back up to kind of normal range. People are reticent to go into shelters, of course, right? People are reticent to call the police on their abusive partner because they don't want to send that person into a COVID situation in jail either, right? So there's all these other forces at work. Police are not gathering evidence in quite the same way inside a home as they were before. They won't tell you that, but in many cases they simply are not, right? Or COVID is being used by abusers who are saying, don't come near me, I have COVID, right? To police, I've heard of that. There just is an unbelievable number of constellations. I spoke to a woman in Texas who said she had a client whose husband coughed on her because he believed he had COVID. So it's being weaponized in all sorts of ways. And the homicide rates, we won't have hard homicide data until 2021 of this period of time, probably fall of 21. But we know that homicides are up in Chicago, in Milwaukee, in Washington, D.C. I spoke to a DA in Milwaukee who, at the end of May 2019, they had 24 homicides, which was about average for them. The end of May 2020, they had 58. Yeah. So we know that this period of time is bad. We don't know how bad. We know that guns in March and April, gun sales skyrocketed in this country. And where you have guns, you have domestic violence homicide, 100% full stop. So there's an almost endless constellation of ways that COVID is interacting to make this situation so much more dangerous. I know in DC with DC Safe, I live in DC, many of you probably live in DC. DC Safe is stretched as thin as you can imagine being stretched. They need hotel rooms. They need hotel rooms to be donated. They need funding. I mean, it is a terribly scary time. Let me say though, this is a really long answer, I apologize. But let me just say there's one little bit of silver lining I discovered. I wrote for the New Yorker a piece that came out a couple of weeks ago about abuser intervention classes during COVID, because of course, many of those, the ones they were all held in person prior to COVID, and many of them went to Zoom online. And they couldn't, in most jurisdictions, they could not make them mandatory through probation and parole offices anymore once they went to Zoom, because the offices were closed or they were not operating with full, employees, or because abusers didn't have access to the internet and so they couldn't make them mandatory. Whatever the reasoning was, in most places they were not made mandatory. And the places I looked at, those men attending those abuser intervention programs, 80% of them were still attending via Zoom. That is such an important little detail that we need to think about, because it flies in the face of what we assume about a violent man, that he won't seek help, that he won't ask for help, that he won't reach out. And I think there's an expert named Juan Carlos Arian who works for Futures Without Violence, who's quoted in that piece, and he says, this is turning the paradigm on its head of what we think about when we think about men asking for help. And I think it's a really important point going forward. That was a really long answer, I apologize.
No, that's okay. It leads to a question that I do have. I mean, you have written about the essential and important focus on domestic violence victims and survivors, most of whom are women and children. But in the book, there's a whole section that's crucially illustrating kind of that domestic violence is a men's issue, that the system of patriarchy and misogyny really doesn't serve abusers, and you tell their stories too. So I'm curious if you can like talk about your choice to highlight this in the book. And the second part of that is what other innovations in abuser interventions could look like.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I feel like we're just now sort of thinking about it as a social science. When I say just now, I mean 20 years, 30 years, right? Like, not, it's, it's relatively young as a social science. And also it has no funding in this country. Nobody is funding abuser intervention programs. I mean, in the UK, they have a hotline, a domestic violence.
Of course we don't.
Hotline.
No, I'm engaged in it in my
Somebody
brain.
is
I'm gonna ask
unmuted.
you to mute yourself. Here we go.
I tried to actually talk through that, and then I was like, oh, the words are all jumbled in my head. I don't know which ones are mine and which ones are hers. So in the UK, they have an abusers intervention hotline. So if somebody is about to be violent or feels that kind of boiling rage, they can call, they can text, they can have a web chat. We don't have that here. We don't have any kind of buddy system like they do for AA. When someone graduates from an abusers intervention class, we go, great, that was 40 weeks of your life, and now you're back into the same world that created you in the first place. This is not a logical way to approach social change, I don't think, without having more inputs and more kind of infrastructure. So I think questions like these are ones that we have going forward. For me, writing the book, the abusers, I mean, and I get a little bit of, like the feminist in me is always like, how do I say this in a way that is like aligned with my own personal beliefs and social beliefs? But abusers are left out of the conversation by and large. Sometimes rightly so, right? Like, we need to hear from victims. We need to address the needs of victims. Like those are acute, right? And the needs of abusers are oftentimes not acute in quite the same way. But if we want actual change, if we want to stop abuse at its core, we have to engage those discussions, and we have to engage those people. So I do spend the whole middle part of the book, which is called the beginning, because it's where violence originates, is with abusers. I spend a lot of time in prisons, a lot of time in jails, talking to guys. And what you find once you get past the artifice, I mean, of course they put on like a bravado for me, and I know that's going to happen. But once you kind of get past that and get to something real, what you start to hear about is the pain from their childhoods, the abuse that they suffered as children, the vulnerabilities that they are afraid to sort of show, or that they're carrying. And so domestic violence, the root of domestic violence is pain. Whether you stand here with the victim or here as an abuser, it is pain, deep human pain. And I think that is important information going forward.
Yeah, it's, we're experiencing a particularly painful period of time too in the country, right? The quarantine, it's quite painful on so many levels, with job stresses, economics, the pain of and fear of the virus itself, and death. And so it seems to me like it's also, this period of time could also even elevate and trigger painful past traumas for many people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. I mean, that was another moment again where I was like, oh, my professional work in working with women has always focused then too on the women's side of domestic violence, the survivor side. And
I don't know how many people are watching who've already read the book, but I'll just mention for those who have read it, there's a guy in there that it kind of, I clearly love on the page, and everybody kind of ends up loving him, Dante Lewis, whose struggle is he's very honest about his struggle. He's very real, and I love that honesty about him. And he was, when we left him in the book, he was in prison in Pennsylvania. And then he got transferred, and I lost track of him. I didn't know where he got transferred to or when he was getting out. And it turned out he got transferred to Florida, and then I think Kentucky, and and he was all over the place. He called me in March right before the pandemic, and he calls me Ray. Yo, Ray. I love it. He was out and he was thrilled and he was doing great. I mean, he was quarantined in San Francisco, but he was really happy to be out of prison. And he's really, really struggling now. 5 months into this or whatever we're in, I'm really, really scared for him. So these forces are huge, huge. And if anyone is listening and has, a good resource in San Francisco, like just a friend, like the guy needs a friend who's not violent. I just want to put that call out there because I'm like rooting for him, I'm like home team rooting for Dante.
That's interesting that you talk about the high rate of attendance at the Zoom intervention classes or groups.
Mm-hmm.
That indicates also a desire for that human connection that we can have through technology.
I know, there were a couple of guys, so they do these interviews with the guys every week after to kind of chart their just their emotional, where they are.
Mm-hmm.
And most of them in general are really grateful that this is still a resource because they've lost so many other resources in their lives, as we all have, right? So many of us have lost things just immediately. And they've said, for some of them, the classes are easier now. They don't have to find childcare. They don't have to find bus fare to get downtown. They join from their cars, from laundry rooms, from bedrooms, wherever they can carve out a little bit of private time. And there's one guy that his quote sort of stays with me. And he said, my wife can tell that I come out of that room a different man than I go in. And I can tell too. And it really means something that my family sees me trying. It doesn't mean I'm perfect, but they see me trying. And I feel like he said, I feel like they are more patient with me. And because they're more patient with me, I'm more patient with them. I think there is something powerful in the visual of watching somebody like have an honest struggle, really.
And that's, that speaks to an individual level change. And I'm also thinking about the systems level change that is necessary. And, we're experiencing right now an upswell of momentum towards police reform. And I'm curious, in your perspective, like how might police reform intersect with domestic violence at this point in time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am 100% behind the reform movement. I believe in, others have put forth proposals on the ways in which police are well suited to this one task, right? This type of violence here, but not as well suited to calls of mental health issues or calls of, and I think that is true of domestic violence as well. Some calls are absolutely 100% there's violence happening. It's very scary. The police need to intervene. But the fact is, many police around the country are not all that well trained when it comes to domestic violence. They're not trained to recognize, for example, one of the most dangerous signs of potential domestic violence homicide, which is strangulation. In Washington, D.C., our police officers are not trained. We're supposed to be this really progressive place, and they're not trained on strangulation. I have yet to come across any that are, right? Or they're not trained on conflict resolution. They're not trained on hostage situations that are specific to domestic violence. If you have a hostage situation at a bank, that the motivation of that hostage taker is that he or she wants to get out of the bank alive. That is not true in a case of domestic violence, and it changes the psychology, the dynamics, the risk, the dangerousness, everything. And we're not training our officers in that. So I think, one of the things that impresses me with what DC Safe has done, and one of the reasons I include them in my book, is that they do have this really strong partnership with local police. That like when the police make a call, they do call that response line that's down there in the courtroom, the courthouse, which I'm sure is haunted on the weekends. They have someone that they can call right there who is a domestic violence expert and a domestic violence advocate. Many of those calls, though, I think could be handled without the police. I think that they could be handled with conflict resolution, with a social worker, with the domestic violence advocate. I also would like to see more domestic violence advocates going around with police officers. You know, I know that DC Safe tries to have one sort of dedicated police car on every shift dedicated to domestic violence with an advocate in that car. But at the moment, they just don't have the funding for 24/7, 365 days a week, that kind of programming. But to me, that's a really great way forward, because then you have the expert right there, right?
Mm-hmm. So it's not just about training. More training doesn't solve all the problem. It's the resources.
It's not just about training. I mean, it's really about community involvement. I don't think we need as many police as we do, but I think we need a lot more community involvement from all of us.
What about on the side of criminal justice system, not just police reform, but incarceration? What opportunities are there to reform that would have an impact on domestic violence?
Wow. How much time
Small
have you
question, tiny question. We got like 3 minutes,
You know,
so.
I have to say, I'm reading Emily Bazelon's amazing book, Charged, right now, which probably many of your book club folks have read. It just won the Silver Gavel Award. I was an honorable mention, but I was so happy for her because this book is amazing. I mean, prosecutorial power is pretty terrifying. Criminal justice reform, there's so many. How can I narrow it down to like a simple answer? A lot of our laws are based in what I would call very gendered historical contexts. So, for example, our self-defense laws and our stand your ground laws seem to be, the research seems to be, I say that, I'm saying that a tiny bit sarcastically, that men use those far more often than women do in terms of their getting off. There's that famous case from Florida, right, where George Zimmerman gets off by using stand your ground.
Mm-hmm.
He's not even in his home, against a young boy with a bag of candy. And then there's the woman who, I'm forgetting her name, but was abused for 20 years, shoots a warning shot into the ceiling and gets, or she wasn't abused for 20 years, she was abused for years, shoots a warning shot into the ceiling and gets put away for 20 years. Doesn't wound him, kill him, hit him, nothing, right? Now she was let out after 3 or 4 years because there was such an outcry, but she's one of thousands across this country right now. We have no national statistic. I'm trying to get it right now. It's gonna take me a long time, but we have no national stat on how many of the 11,000 women who are incarcerated for homicide in this country right now killed someone who was abusing them. But if you ask domestic violence researchers and experts, they'll say it's probably somewhere around 50%, which means we might have 5,500 women who shot someone who was abusing them. And that's how they got free, right? This whole, I mean, the NRA wants us to believe that women just simply need to arm themselves and they won't die at the hands of an abuser, right? They see this as a feminist issue. Well, all you need to do is look at those 11,000 women and say, well, those women armed themselves and look where it got them, right? They were unable to use self-defense. So, I could go on and on about criminal justice reform, but there's states where women can't use their domestic violence histories in their own defense, or they take plea deals because, they suspect that a judge is going to give them a raw deal, which may very well be true. It is a real problem. And I think, to add to this, there's a lot of talk of mass incarceration and reforms around incarceration. And to me, that is a conversation that needs to happen hand in hand with domestic violence, because we can't have incarceration reforms over prisons and jails without talking about how do we handle domestic violence and domestic violence misdemeanors. And here's my idea, by the way.
Bring it on.
I'm not going to take credit for inventing this idea, but I'm going to take credit for shouting it from the rooftop. We have a fabulous infrastructure of more than 2,000 shelters right now in this country. They're already built, they're up, they're running, they have electricity. Let's get the victims out of the shelters and the kids and the women and put men with domestic violence misdemeanors in those shelters and in abuser education systems. Costs nothing. We solved mass incarceration. We solved the shelter problem. We solved, right? Like, let's try it. What have we got to lose? It sounds like a ludicrous idea, which most great things do until someone actually tries them. So every time I give a public talk now, I'm like, here's a solution I want to see happening in the States.
It's the call to action for everybody listening today.
There you go. There's your call to action.
And this then brings us to, I think, one of like my last question for you before I invite our participants to submit their questions for you, which is around societal change, right? Domestic violence has been a problem throughout history. It's not just in this country. It's not just in the past 50 years. It's always been a problem. So you've been researching and reporting on this for many years as well. What is it going to take for society to change? How do we take that mantle up?
That's an easy question.
Yeah.
It is easy. I'm being somewhat facetious, but the thing is, we have to talk about it. So this is helpful, right? Like, talking about it is helpful. I think that the Me Too movement, one of the things that it did, although I would also argue that the Me Too movement has been somewhat silenced and needs to regain momentum. But I think it gave us a roadmap for how to talk about things that ultimately feel very shameful. I think we need to remind victims over and over and over again, as we did with the rise of the Me Too movement. I think we need to remind them that there is nothing shameful about being a victim, and it is not your fault. And we need to talk about it, because that's the only way we arrive at solutions together.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the one thing that I feel like COVID has provided us, oddly enough, is an opportunity to talk to our neighbors, to be there. And I mean, I'm talking about like literal neighbors, right? Like, leave a note at your neighbor's house saying, I'm social distancing, you know, with my family. I kind of need people right now. Do you want to do a socially distanced walk? And get to know some of the people who live around you, right? They're not going to, I mean, victims aren't going to come out right away and say, hello, my name's Rachel. I'm a victim of domestic violence. But like, you know, if you have a neighbor and you know that your neighbor is there for you, you're much more likely to reach out. And I think, you know, you can create a code word with that neighbor. Look, if I ever use the name of my kid's favorite toy, right, it means call the police. That's what I would say. There's a lot of talk about creating codes, and I think people need to have individual codes, because if you do what they did like in Spain with mask 29 or something like that, mask 19, with pharmacies, they went in and said, you know, at some point the abuser is going to be wise to that code. So at any rate, I do think that COVID provides us with an opportunity to reach out in a way that might otherwise feel weird or uncomfortable.
An opportunity, and I could also argue an imperative, especially when so many of the other systems that we have at schools where there are teachers, or in a religious place, or at the libraries where they're shut down. So people who are, you know, identify.
Uh-oh. Dana, I don't know if my internet is bad. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. I think
Okay.
we might have lost Dana.
Dana got frozen. Okay. Should we move on to some questions? I see some like chat questions happening.
Yeah, I think that is a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
So here's one from Sarah Potter. It says, one thing this pandemic has revealed is how poorly we protect vulnerable populations. The pandemic has exacerbated more than caused health and safety disparities. Can you comment on what you saw in terms of how your systems failed to protect victims/survivors, especially those with low incomes or racial ethnic minorities, or those with substance abuse or mental health issues?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the thing is, we have this idea of what a victim is supposed to be, right? And a victim is not supposed to have mental health issues. A victim is not supposed to fight back. A victim is not supposed to, you know, have substance abuse issues. And the fact is, victims' lives are messy. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is that this is sometimes the tactic of an abuser, is that I'm going to make your life messier than mine so that nobody will believe you. Or maybe an abuser is completely unaware, right? And the victim has traumatic brain injury from repeated strangulations. And again, if the police are not trained on how to identify non-visible signs of strangulation, they're not gonna write a police report that reflects the dangerousness. They're gonna downplay it, right? And so if a victim has traumatic brain injury from blunt force trauma to the head or strangulations, they may have poor recall of their own stories, or they may not be able to advocate for themselves in prison. In court. And so what happens is you have all of the stereotypes and the the sort of racism that we all carry, and the classism that we all carry, right along with these other things that say, oh my gosh, she can't remember how she got from that side of the room to the other side of the room, whereas he's very articulate and he's able to say, so I'm going to give him custody of the kids. I mean, the issues, in some ways, they're two separate issues, right? You've got race and ethnicity that play into already a very racist set of systems, right? The police, criminal justice, the judiciary, right? Like these are already kind of inherently racist systems. And then on top of that, you have the expectations of what a victim is supposed to be like. A victim is not supposed to be sarcastic. A victim is not supposed to fight back, right? There's a lot of talk about how women are just as violent as men, right? With lower levels of violence, slaps, kicks, that kind of thing. But the fact is that you have to ask all the time, who is the primary aggressor, right? And what is retaliatory violence versus the original violence, right? Because women often retaliate. I mean, if somebody was beating me up, would I just sit there and not fight back? Hell no. I'd be like one of those cartoon characters with the pan, right? Like, right? Am I an imperfect victim? So I think that's a good question. And I think it's I don't know yet what the answer is. How do you get racism out of the judiciary, sexism out of the judiciary? How do you get this expectations of, not having mental health? I covered a trial in December for the New Yorker of a woman named Nicole Adamando in New York who had more evidence of her domestic violence than any victim I had seen ever. She had 2 forensic nurses exams. People saw her all the time with visible injuries, ligature marks around her neck, and bruises and black eyes all the time. And she had 2 therapists who attested to her abuse. She finally shot her abuser. And the prosecutor in her case talked about the fact that she had been a victim as a child, and then later as a young adult, or like an older teenager, and then with this guy. And somehow her multiple victimhood made her look unreliable. Is one of many things the prosecutor used, but it made her unreliable as in telling her own story. I mean, it's unbelievable when you hear these stories.
It is, yeah. And we definitely see thousands of cases through the civil protection order process each year. And I can definitely attest to being in court many times myself, which is kind of like with my jaw open there. I have another good question for you. This says, this is from Rebecca Maxwell. I'm an immigration attorney doing adjudication of the policy around visas for domestic violence protection and other victimization. I see the domestic violence issues from both sides, victims as well as perpetrators who are seeking to establish that they have rehabilitated. I find this analysis or making a determination on this issue extremely difficult. This is addressed in the middle of your book, but do you believe with the right resources and treatment, an abuser can ever be truly rehabilitated?
I really do. I know I get asked that question a lot, and I know maybe it's hard to believe, but I really do. I think we are not great as a country at offering those resources. And so the challenge is even greater. But I was telling someone last week, I can't remember who, I think it was my agent. I was telling her how as a teenager, I was really violent. I mean, I, in some ways, identify more with the men in my book than I do with the women. I had many fistfights with my stepmother, who's now deceased. I write about her a little bit at the end of the book. I remember when I was 14, I remember having a fistfight with her in a playground at our church. And I did not fight like a girl. Like, I punched, I really wanted to hurt her. And, I'm rehabilitated. I've never been violent toward a partner. I had that as a teenager, but I really believe that it can happen. I just don't think we have great programs. There is a program, I will tell you, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that I just learned about. It's not in my book. I wrote about it in the New Yorker a couple weeks ago, but it's called the Alma Center, ALMA Center in Milwaukee. And they have, I will tell you, hands down, the most unique abusers intervention program I have ever come across. It's a year long. It is really incredible. And I would love to see that get replicated in more countries. But before I turn that question, before we move on to another question, Natalia, I actually wonder if you might tackle that. Like, how would you tell her to try to assess for accurate, because I feel like that's a really important question, for accurate rehabilitation, or what kind of, measures can you put in if someone screws up, as we do, because we're human?
Yeah, I mean, wow. I agree with you that there isn't, I think because initially in our movement, we said we don't want to consider the idea of rehabilitation because it takes away from this idea of the fact that violence should be a crime. So I think that there was initially some kind of resistance. Not that I don't believe that there is rehabilitation, that there can be, I absolutely do. I think, though, that created a situation where there wasn't a holistic approach to domestic violence.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, this also includes the society of men out there that need to be responsive and need to step up and need to want to change their own culture in those degrees. So I would say that it's difficult because when you're talking about domestic violence, a lot of what we always think is the abuse itself, the physical. That's why I think your book is the title is so appropriate. But that the most damaging things are actually things that are difficult to measure, like repeated emotional abuse, financial abuse, just a situation where you're literally breaking down a person from inside out. How does that happen? That happens within conversations, with body language, with the story you said about the rattlesnake. There's so many subtle nuances to the abuse that then allows for the actual physical violence. The physical violence is the symptom, not the actual problem. And so
I like what Eve Ensler says. She goes by V now. And she says, like, she's so outspoken. She's like, domestic violence is a men's problem. We don't beat and rape ourselves. It's a men's problem. I love that.
Oh my God. I saw her in college once and I'm still like big fan.
Yeah.
So Dana's actually back on. I don't know if I can turn into her. Hi.
I'm back in time to wrap us up. Apologies.
Wait, can I
Wi-Fi.
I'm sorry, Dana, I'm going to I don't ever do this, but since I know Natalia, she could be mad at me and that's okay. But there's one question on here that someone wrote that I actually have never been asked before, and I want to address it because I have a background in stuff. And it's from Patricia, and it talks about her experience with religious institutions, and in particular the Catholic Church, Knights of Columbus. They fail to acknowledge domestic violence. There's this blaming of women. They rally around support for the men, and how can that be changed? And I'm thrilled with the question because I don't get asked that question enough. And I will say there is a woman, I'm traveling right now. I'm in a hotel room, a fabulous hotel room, but I can't remember that. I'll email Natalia, but there's a woman in North Carolina who works specifically with victims of domestic violence from or in religious contexts, and she has just like a support group, even just for a place to call in. And I'll get her name and her organization for you, Natalia, so maybe you can, if someone has an email for you. But this is so important. And one thing I say to groups all over the country, I've spoken, I think 90 times in the last year, and every time I speak, I say, any local domestic violence agency that does a training, and I know they do trainings all the time because they're all incredible and they're doing like God's work, but they need to be inviting their local clergy to every training that they do from every kind of religion, right? Because the fact is, we talked about police reform, victims call their clergy far more than they call police. And so it is really, really important. And I think, I don't know how you change churches. I do know that I grew up in an evangelical church where, all the teachings you hear that, women are subservient to men and men are the, the head of the household, and, women have to do what men say. And I mean, it's a wonder that I have become the person I've become, given the honest to God, like, subservience with which I was, taught, like, all my teenage years. And it's near and dear to my heart because it is a great disservice to women, to children, even to men. Let me just end by saying the patriarchy is not doing men any favors, because they end up in prison or they end up committing suicide. Suicide is the #1 killer of men in this country between 15 and 34. That's not a society that is healthy, right? So I'm glad for the question. I don't know that I answered it adequately, but I want to keep talking about it. Okay, now I'll turn it over to you, Dana.
Well, can I raise you a one question also, which is from Julia, which is, can you also speak to the systems that are theoretically meant to help survivors, such as child welfare, hospitals, even some social service agencies that continue the power dynamics and therefore trauma? While service providers are important, it's also critical to rethink our roles to be collaborative, strength-based, and address the white savior heritage of these professions. For example, social work. Can you speak to that?
Well, you just wanted to finish with just a light, easy question, didn't you? I mean, prison is the best example of that, right? Like, there's talk all the time about how prison is just another parallel manifestation of what a victim or an abuser has already endured, right? And this is why, I mean, it's interesting because there's talk now of, in my book, I have a section on what's called the danger assessment, which is this tool that was created back in the 80s by an incredible woman named Jacqueline Campbell at Johns Hopkins University. And it's essentially, the danger assessment is the 20 highest risk indicators for potential domestic violence homicide. So using weighted answers, it tries to predict domestic violence homicide before it happens. And if you want to see what the risks are, or what these danger signs are, you can go to dangerassessment.org, I think is the website, or just do a search for danger assessment and you'll see them. And one of the things she said to me recently, just like in the last 3 weeks, is that the danger assessment was created by white women without much thought to race. And that there's conversations happening that are really very recent that I would actually maybe like even credit Ibram Kendi and his anti-racist movement with this in the domestic violence world, that, like, Black women have a very different relationship to power and control than white women do. And that the power and control wheel that is used to kind of explain the dynamics of every domestic violence relationship that was created in the 80s in Minnesota, the power and control wheel, is actually only relevant to white women or to people in white communities. And that Black women will not call the police because they are subject to the same systemic racism that their men are, right? That Black men are. And I think, to me, this is just the beginning of a conversation that we need to have that we just have not had. This is not an answer to her question. It is an acknowledgement of the importance of that question. I will leave you with this thought, though. the jurisdictions across the country that I have found that have done or have the best statistics on domestic violence, the ones where the homicides of men are lower because women have more services to get out and more programming that is successful to get out. Those are ones that work collaboratively and have worked collaboratively for a long time. DC Safe being among them, actually. So collaboration is, I can't say enough about it. Absolutely, it's the way forward, and that I can't answer that question in like the last minute that we have, but I want to acknowledge like that we keep talking about it.
Yeah, I would agree. Thank you. So yeah, as we wrap up, I want to say thank you so much, Rachel, for your time tonight and for elevating voices and experiences of survivors, and really shining light on the reality of domestic violence and giving us more language to talk about it. So we assume that most of you who joined us tonight have read Rachel's book, but if you haven't, of course, we want to encourage you to buy the book. And if you've read it, buy it and give it to somebody else. And the book is available now on paperback. So if you do choose to purchase a copy, I would encourage you to support a local Black-owned bookstore in DC, Loyalty Bookstore. They have the books in stock. And I would also like to personally invite you to join me as a contributor to DC Safe and to make a donation tonight to DC Safe. As we've discussed in our conversation tonight with Rachel, domestic violence survivors are facing unique challenges and risks among the pandemic, more urgent than before even. And as the only 24/7 crisis intervention agency in the district, DC Safe needs to be fully equipped to respond. But since the beginning of the shutdown, they've seen an incredibly increase in calls, over 9,000 calls to their crisis response line, including 3,000 unique referrals. They made 146 on-call dispatches, meeting survivors in person to deliver essential supplies and to facilitate shelter placements and provide support in crisis situations. They've housed 314 clients, including 99 families and 212 children in their safe space crisis shelter, and also made 134 emergency hotel placements. And this costs money, people, so please donate. Now more than ever, I know we keep hearing now more than ever, but in this case with DC Safe, it's particularly true. It takes all of us now more than ever in this DC Safe community to ensure survivors still have access to safe housing and other services. So I want to encourage you to buy the book, to donate to DC Safe, and to say thank you for your support and your generosity. So thank you again, Rachel, for taking the time to speak with us tonight, and I appreciate all of your great questions as well. Thanks for being part of this evening.
Thank you.
Take care.